Hello, everyone who is here. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation. My name is Sana Sharif, and I am the co-president of the Harvard College Facilitators for Religious, Ethical, and Spiritual Inquiry, also known as FRESI. I am joined by my fellow FRESI board members, Bilal Wouri, who also serves as co-president, Praniti Parikh, Abby McElroy, Hannah McQuistion. And we'd like to welcome you all to today's conversation. So evidently, we are living in a time marked by confusion, uncertainty, and fear. And in the past few weeks, so much of our reality has changed. The majority of states have enacted stay-at-home orders, hospitals are being flooded with COVID-19 patients, and streets have been left desolate. So at a time of so much unprecedented change, can we lean on faith to help us navigate through it? To answer this question and provide faith-based perspectives on this public health crisis, we have an excellent lineup of Harvard Chaplains and Faculty. Our panelists represent a range of faith traditions, and we are so grateful to be joined by each and every one of them. We have Chaplain Greg Epstein, who is the Humanist Chaplain at Harvard University and the convener for Ethical Life at MIT's Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life. Tammy and Pat McLeod, a dynamic husband and wife duo who are members of the international interdenominational Christian organization called Cru and serve as Cru chaplains at Harvard University. Together, they serve as advisors to both Christian Impact and its athletic ministry, Athletes in Action. And Tammy is also the director of college ministry for Park Street Church in downtown Boston. We are also joined by Stephanie Paulsell, the Susan Shallcross Schwartz Professor of the Practice of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School, and also the interim minister at the Harvard Memorial Church. Imam Khalil Abdur Rashid, who serves as the first full-time Harvard University Muslim chaplain, instructor of Muslim studies at Harvard Divinity School, and adjunct lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, as well as Rabbi Jonah Steinberg, the executive director of Harvard Hillel and a Jewish chaplain at Harvard University. Welcome all to this conversation. We are so glad to have you today. So before we dive into the conversation, we will take care of some housekeeping, which is pretty important. This event will run for 90 minutes. We will open the floor for questions during the latter part of the discussion. To ask questions, we will be using the chat box feature, which you can actually find at the bottom center of your screen. It says chat, and I'm sure you'll be able to locate it. So please type in your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get through most of them when the time approaches. Thank you everyone in advance for your cooperation, and we hope this runs smoothly. So let's get started with the first question. Many religions seem to process disaster very differently. How can we essentially understand the COVID-19 pandemic from different faith perspectives? Is it a punishment from God, a tribulation, a means of purification, or some other interpretation possibly? I would love for everyone's perspective on this, and if it's okay, can we start with Chaplain Epstein, if possible?
We could, yeah. I mean, I don't know that it's. I don't know if it's a fit for me to go first on this one.
I'm so sorry, you are muted. Yep. Let me unmute.
There we go. No, okay. You got it? No.
I can hear you.
We can actually hear him.
Not anymore. Hold on. I think you.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was just my computer. Please continue.
Wait, now you're muted. Okay, you're good.
Yeah. Now, yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't know if it's the right fit for me to go first on this, but I mean, why not? Wait, yes, no, you're.
If you.
Okay. All right. Yes. So.
From this perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana, first of all, just for organizing this. It's great to be on the line with everybody. Sorry for the foibles, but I guess we probably all had some Zoom foibles over the past week or two, huh? Yeah. it's a bit of an awkward fit for me to go first on this question. I'm happy to do it, but just want to acknowledge the awkwardness of the fact that I'm here representing a perspective that is humanist or secular or atheist or non-religious or whatever you call it. And I've been thinking a lot about this discussion and wanting to give you sort of a helpful resource, which is understanding a perspective like my communities without having it seem like a dismissive perspective or a disagreeable perspective, even if there are places where we disagree. So I'll try to answer just very briefly, and we'll look forward to seeing what everybody else is feeling and thinking and how it fits. From a humanist perspective, this is what it is. It's a virus. It's a form of life that is, alive as part of the same process that allowed us to be alive. And it's part of our natural world. It's part of what is good in the world that we know, and it's part of what's awful. And we are, we're forced to contend with it. We don't want to contend with it. We wish it were out of existence, but we don't have the ability to make it so just yet. And so we're faced with something that really, from my perspective, from a humanist perspective, we face every day. Every day of our lives, every single one of us faces the fact that we are part of a cycle of life and death, and we don't have control over where we fall in that cycle. We don't have control over what our lives are fully like. We try to control it. We do our best. Sometimes it feels like we're so in control, but we're not. We never are, really. And all we can do, from my perspective, about a situation like this is fight back against a world that isn't what we wish it could be, and try to make it more of what we want it to be, and less of what we find so tragic and painful and scary and sad. And so we do that, and the best way to do that, of course, is together in community, together in solidarity, together in love. But that's, of course, what makes this so freaking new and unpleasant and scary all over again for us, is that we can't. Here we are, we're trying to do it together. Does this feel together to you? We're trying our best. It really is novel, and we'll see how we do. But I feel so much better about our collective chances to do okay in a moment like this historically, when I'm on the line with good people like you. So thank you.
Thank you, Chaplain Epstein. I think it's very necessary to have the humanist perspective in there as well, kind of a kind of theology based. I mean, this is a belief system, but a non-theology based perspective in there too. So thank you so much. I think it was good.
Appreciate being invited. I mean, on behalf of my community, we really appreciate being able to be a part of a discussion like this.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Can we please have the next speaker possibly go? If possible, Imam Khalil, could you shed some light on this question?
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sana, for hosting this, and thank you, everybody. It's good to see everybody and good to be here with all of you. I'm going to try to articulate a little bit what we understand from the Islamic tradition, how the Muslim tradition perceives situations like this in terms of what the text says and sacred teachings, etc. There are two basic ideas that help punctuate Muslim perspectives on these issues from the text, definitely, and from the tradition. The first idea that it is part and parcel of the human narrative and the human story to endure situations and circumstances where we are and will be tested. And, from a scriptural point of view, the text explains that tests will come in 5 forms. First is fear. It says that the divine will test you with things with fear, with hunger or desire, or yearning for something, which is loss of life, and then the loss of productivity, right? The loss of the fruits of your labor, right? And that those are the 5 sort of domains that human beings are tested with from the time the time of their entry into the world to the time of their exiting the world. We can all expect to encounter one or more or all of these. And certainly one could argue that the coronavirus situation tests most people in all of these combined: fear and hunger, loss of income, loss of life, and loss of productivity. And then the text says, but give glad tidings to those that patiently fear, those who continually choose to go through those things. So we're told, that the text explains to us and frames our religious belief in Islam that part of our story is to endure trials and tests, but not just to endure it or face it, but to go through it. And the reason we are encouraged to go through it is because we become better. We rise to our fullest potential only through displaying that kind of courage and that kind of strength, that we only know and realize what we're made of when we're tested. But there's a diversity of tests. And in this sense, COVID-19 or things like it, and anything that would resemble some kind of major calamity or whatnot, preferably should not be viewed as some kind of punishment and whatnot, but instead should be viewed as a crisis that involves us to get ready for going through a test to see what we are made of, what could we discover about ourselves, both at the individual level and also at the societal level. So so for example, if I go through, if I lose my job personally, outside of a COVID-19 context and something happens, I lose my job, that's my kind of test, right? When you got an entire society of folks losing their jobs and everybody's doing that because of one, major event, that's where we all are unified in going through this together. So on the one hand, it's a crisis, and on the other hand, it's a call for solidarity and unity. So this is the first thing that the scripture actually tells us. The Islamic scripture tells us that we will be tested in these 5 areas, but give glad tidings, give good news to those that patiently endure. That's the text. The second component is sort of the way that plays out in our lives. And here is another text that animates Muslim life and how we think about things. And the Prophet Muhammad said that when God wants to test people, this is another religious tradition, narrative in the Islamic tradition, that when God wants to test people, the text goes like this: when God loves people, he chooses to test them. That's the text. When God loves people, he gives them a test. And then the text goes on, the narration goes on to say, so those that patiently endure the test get the reward of their patient perseverance. And those that choose to reject the test get the consequence of rejecting, the test, right? So those that choose to go forward with it, they get the benefit of that, whatever comes with it, and the medal at the end, the reward at the end. Those that choose to outright reject the test get the consequence of that as well. So from this, we understand that the reason behind the testing from an Islamic point of view is that the divine wants something more out of us, that God wants something more out of us, and it is an extension of divine love, that it is an extension of divine care, that we are supposed to rise up to something more than what we are now. And it's out of the divine mercy, it's out of God's love that he introduces us to our futures. God introduces to our future selves, right, through the test. That in some way we can't discover who we are potentially unless we go through this trial and this difficulty, right? And so in that sense, it is part and parcel of reaching our greatest human potential, etc. And so in this sense, it's not perceived, although there are traumas that happen through every single difficulty, and certainly COVID-19 is, we are told to expect, tremendous, loss of life and difficulty and tragedy. Although that is the case, still, from an Islamic point of view, we are told that, the encountering suffering, encountering trials and difficulty is part of what makes us human on the one hand. And second, going through that is part of what it improves us and makes us better at being human as well, right? And so there's no part of being human that any person could experience that would make them absent of experiencing loss, or absent of experiencing some kind of trauma or difficulty. The story of the human being is that, but also the story of the human being is not limited to that. It is about getting through that. It is about going through that. And that is the human story. And that is what is behind sort of the system. That's from the Islamic point of view. That's not to make the test better. That's just to give it purpose and meaning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chaplain Khalil. Can we also hear from Chaplain McLeod in response to this question?
In the Christian tradition, sickness, death, disease, and natural disasters are the groaning of a good world that God created, but is now corrupted by sin. And 3 times in Romans chapter 8, the author uses the word groaning. And so the groaning is there. Something's not right with the world. And sometimes that can overwhelm us, but it also talks in the scriptures about how God is present in that moment. So perhaps what we need more than answering these questions that you posed to us today is to recover the biblical tradition of lament. Moving beyond our self-centered worry about our sins and failings and looking more broadly at the suffering in the world like we're enduring right now. And when I think about lament, I think of the Psalms. Psalms is the prayer book of the Hebrew people. Praise of God saturates these songs, but so does lament. The psalmists were honest with God and they were real. They poured out their hearts to him. They wept before him. They shared their deepest desires with him. And I lived in the Psalms for several years after our son's high school football accident, during which he became severely disabled for life. And as I read, I was able to take in the saving truth that I was not alone in my suffering. I was reminded of who God is, who I am, and how God cares for me. When we were asked 3 weeks ago to stay home, except for getting groceries or walking outside, I began reading through the Psalms again, one a day. And yes, these poems often come out into the light by the end with a fresh sense of God's presence and hope, but not to explain the trouble. They provide reassurance in it. The point of lament in the biblical tradition is not just that it's an outlet for our frustration or sorrow or loneliness and the sheer inability to understand what's happening or why, but the mystery is that in the biblical story, God also laments. So I love N.T. Wright's article that is in Time magazine, and the date is March 29th. He says it's no part of the Christian vocation then to be able to explain what's happening and why. In fact, it is part of the Christian vocation not to be able to explain and to lament instead. As the Spirit laments within us, so we become, even in our self-isolation, small shrines where the presence and healing love of God can dwell.
Thank you.
So I will add it's not exactly what I thought she was going to say, but it's close. I'm gonna be a little more personal. Tammy and I have had our own sort of mini version of having our world turned upside down by a grief-related tragedy of our son getting injured. So the one thing I do want to say is that I don't feel like there is a one way, right way that Christians process grief, and there certainly wasn't with us. And so, for example, Tammy did do exactly what she just said. She spent every morning reading through the Psalms, the prayer book of the Hebrew people, and about 40% of those Psalms are prayers of lament, people just being honest with God about their pain. And God met her and carried her through the journey that we've been on through those Psalms, and she's doing it again right now. So that's, yeah. So and for me, it was different. I would say that what carried me through and helps me to process stuff like this, it is more just the story of Jesus, and in particular, what we began today, which is a Holy Week that really focuses on remembering that this problem that we're facing of suffering goes right into the heart of God in the story of the Holy Week of Jesus, where he as the Son of God becomes a crucified God. And so for me personally, it was moments of prayer when I was overwhelmed by and first of all, I was overwhelmed by grief and sorrow and sadness and pain. But it brought me tremendous consolation and tremendous peace, knowing that I was in the presence of a crucified God, a God who understands my pain, a God who understands suffering. In fact, a God who came into the world to not only save us from the brokenness and suffering that's in the world, but from the brokenness that's rooted deep inside of me. And so that's how I've processed and that's how I'm doing with this. Every day I find myself thanking God that I'm praying to a God who understands my pain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. Rabbi Steinberg, can we also have your perspective on this? Okay, you are unmuted now.
I am unmuted.
Yes.
Boy, am I glad to be here. And Sana, thank you for getting this together. There is so much that is beautiful and compelling in what Greg and Khalil and Tammy and Pat have said, and that I find so important to hear in this time. And so the gratitude, to those of you who've put this forum together is also gratitude for bringing these faces together and these voices together, which is really a source of uplift for me, certainly, and I hope for all of us. So thank you. Having heard so much that's beautiful And also, I just want to take a moment to underscore the truthfulness to oneself that I'm hearing in all of these voices that I appreciate so much. What can I add from a Jewish perspective? Judaism is founded on the audacity, we might call it the chutzpah, to say that human action is consequential. That human action is perhaps even cosmically consequential. Now that's audacity, blended hopefully with a good deal of humility. And there are several ways to understand that. And I want to present two of them to you that a very dear friend and colleague mentioned just recently in a forum that we hosted online through Harvard Hillel. And then I want to offer you also a third. The two paradigms that my friend and colleague and often teacher Rabbi Shai Held from New York mentioned are, on the one hand, the Deuteronomic model, and on the other hand, the wisdom model. The Deuteronomic model would go something like, yes, your actions are consequential, says the divine to humankind. And I have laid out certain precepts for you. Now, if you do certain things, if you do X, to quote Shai, I, God, will be irritated and I will bring down Y upon you. That's the Deuteronomic model. The wisdom model, and by the way, we're coming up on kind of a festival of that in the Passover holiday that I want to come back to at the end, because that's a tempting model. But I think perhaps only Scripture can presume to tell us a story like that. The wisdom model goes something, again to quote Shai, like, when you do certain things, you unleash certain realities in the world, and those will come back to you. Right? That's maybe more in line with the way we tend to think today in this age of climate collapse and so forth. And whether we think that, well, God used to operate that way and now operates this way, or more phenomenologically, we used to understand the world that way and now we understand it more this way. But I want to offer also a third, and it comes from most overtly in the Jewish mystical tradition, but I think it's also deeply rooted even before the flourishing of that. And that would be this world. And here, by the way, I venture this with extreme humility and with saying right up front, as others have said, we're human beings. We can't know completely. But a Jewish mystical view would say, this world is an expression of all the potentialities that are within the divine. And so, yes, that means love, and yes, that means beauty, and yes, that means splendor, and yes, that means glory. But it also means wrath, and it also means harshness, and it also means the tearing down as well as the building up. And so to bring that to the consequentiality of human action, what we're gifted with as conscious creatures in this world, much as we are beset by waves that are way beyond our control, as most of my colleagues have said, what we're given is the opportunity to choose, to channel, to find and reveal those aspects in whatever moment we find ourselves. So, where is the love that is within the harshness of this moment? Where is the beauty? I see it right here amid the catastrophe, right? As conscious beings in a world that, if we think about it in terms of a creation narrative, if you like, why would the divine create a world? Or if you're more comfortable with this way, why would divinity beget a cosmos with a planet like this in it and a species like this in it? Well, there are two ways of thinking of that. One would be, there must have been way back when some irritant, something within God's self that God could only work out by saying, you know what, I'm going to put it all out there and see if it comes back to me in love. And maybe that's the decision we get to make as human beings. And another way of saying it, which is possibly the same way, just in different words, and this may sound blasphemous, is that somewhere deep within unutterable oneness, our one God very much wished to be two. And I'll tell you why, according to that tradition, because the one that is the result of this mystical arithmetic of love, in which 1 + 1 = 1, is so much more fulfilled a one than the one that exists without there ever having been a story. I think about that a lot these days with where we are. What's a world that is, what's the world that we would like to emerge back into? What do we want to make that world, and how mindfully can we choose our steps when we get to take them with much more freedom out in the world again? So that's where I'm to come back to Passover just briefly, because that's the temptation, right? The Passover gives us the story of a wicked, obstinate Pharaoh. You may find that tempting in times like these in certain ways, who is, upon whom plagues are visited because of his obstinacy. Again, I say, that kind of storytelling is for Scripture. When we venture beyond what Greg said at the very beginning of this, we run the very, very serious risk of explaining suffering, which winds up being justifying suffering, which winds up, in effect, as a very dear teacher of mine who's a survivor of the Holocaust once pointed out, winds up being saying, you know what, it should have happened. And if it hadn't happened, we ought to have made it happen because it's justice. I don't think any of us can presume that kind of attitude. No matter how much we may see a Pharaoh anywhere. We cannot be the ones that say the world somehow or some of us in it deserved a plague like this. This is beyond human understanding, except in the humanist sense that we hope and pray, and in the theological sense pray for the human understanding to contend with it. And thank heavens we have those abilities. But again, the temptation of the Passover story is an interesting time to verge into that holiday in which the moral order and the natural order seem to be brought together in this punitive way. That's very much the Deuteronomic model. And just to wrap that up, and again, to quote my friend Shai, the Deuteronomic model also says, I, God, am going to shower you with blessings. But the hazard of that is that you're going to think that you did it all yourself. And that then you will act in that way, and these blessings will reveal their shadow sides, or in effect, in some ways become curse. But to come back, it's we get to decide so much. How do we enter the world in this moment carefully, mindfully, caringly? And how do we want to re-enter it again much more fully when we get to?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Steinberg. Can we please hear from Professor Paulsell?
Yes, thank you so much, Sana, for organizing us. I'm so grateful for all the wisdom of these colleagues. I'll just add a few things. I think I'm also a Christian, like Pat and Tammy, and also turning to the Psalms in this time. My father had a good friend who's died now, but he was a monk of the Abbey of Gethsemane for years and years, and he prayed the Psalms, multiple times a day, and he used to say the Psalms take us all the way in and all the way down. And if we can't face ourselves in the Psalms, how will we ever be able to change? Which is what I hear Jonah talking about. My faith does not teach that something like this pandemic is being sent by God to teach us something or to punish us for something. you know, as Greg said, viruses are part of existence, they're part of life. And pandemics are certainly part of human existence. I think it feels shocking to us because we've grown up getting vaccinated and we've benefited from all these medical and scientific, you know, advancements, but you don't have to go too far back. My grandmother had polio as a child and always limped. And, you know, there have been many other pandemics through human history. This feels really unusual to us, but in the sweep of human existence, I think it's really not that unusual. And I don't think we know yet what all the conditions are that allowed this virus to arise and take hold. As Jonah said, some of these things are beyond our knowing, and some of them people will figure out. But I don't think it came from God in a targeted sense, but more in the sense of God created this world in which there's lots of forms of life, and this virus is one of the forms of life that has emerged. I do think, though, that this virus has illuminated and confirmed some of the things that our faith traditions teach about what it means to be human, and also things about God. In terms of what it means to be human, this virus has really shown how, how connected we are and how vulnerable we are. There's so many things that make us different from each other. There's so many differences among us. But the one thing we all genuinely share is that we are embodied human creatures. And as St. Jerome said in the 4th century, what one of us can suffer, all of us can suffer. And this virus, I think, this virus doesn't care about our citizenship. This virus doesn't care about, our religious tradition. It's spreading all over the world, crossing boundaries, crossing borders, and it's illuminated, I think, our shared vulnerability and our shared embodiment, and the sacredness of that. Because it's also illuminated how connected we are. And that everybody's life matters for everybody else's life. And, that when we stay home and sacrifice our going out or our gathering or our getting together with people we love, we're literally making it possible for doctors and nurses and technicians and other healthcare workers to do their work. We're making it possible for them to be able to handle the patient load that they have and not to collapse underneath it. That the choices that we make in our own lives have a real effect on other people's lives. And I think what that teaches us about God is that God has placed us in each other's care. And there's something that's a tender responsibility. It's a serious responsibility. I think God's calling to us in the midst of this pandemic, exactly in the way Jonah was talking about. Can we dream another way of living? Can we dream another way of being community? This virus has illuminated not only our connections and our humanity, but it has eliminated the fault lines in our society. Some people the burden of this virus is going to fall more heavily on some people than others. Can we make a world in which we can take better care of each other? If God, as our creator, has placed us in each other's care through the vulnerability of our bodies, can we organize ourselves in a more compassionate way?
Thank you so much, Professor Paulsell, and thank you all for your pearls of wisdom on this and your perspective on this. I'm kind of jumping off from what Professor Paulsell said, but today we kind of stand in a place where, unfortunately, medicine seems to have fallen short. We haven't developed a vaccine for this yet. It seems like it won't be developed until the spring of 2021. And we are all left kind of in a world of suffering and pain and discomfort and unfortunately death. And it's very grim to say that, but I want to focus on this human condition of suffering. And I want to ask, should the suffering that we are that we are experiencing, some more than others, transform us in any way? And what physical and or spiritual value does suffering hold? I think this applies to everyone, both who hold faith close to their heart and I mean those who are not, who don't. So if we can answer this question. Can we begin with Imam Khalil, if that's okay? Okay.
So, you know, suffering is, you know, suffering is, you know, is bifurcated and divided along two different lines. In the Islamic tradition, there's suffering that is introduced into the world because of intentional human conduct, nefarious human conduct, oppressive rulers, etc. Right, and they're innocent. There are people that are victimized by that, and then there's human suffering that occurs through no fault of any person. So, you know, hurricanes and pandemic diseases, etc. Right, through an act that is not attributed to any cause or manager, etc. So, you know, in the sense of the former, you know, human suffering that occurs at the hands of another person, that it becomes the responsibility of community members and individuals to do what they can to interfere and to enact justice, to stop that suffering, eliminate that suffering, to punish those who inflicted that suffering. In the other context of pandemic diseases and hurricanes, there's no one to take there's no justice component in terms of people. But in that case, we are called to rise above our own selfish, our own sense of selfishness, because we can become very selfish in those contexts, to only be concerned about our, and to not have a concern about our neighbors and those that are around us, right? In the same predicament, or there are incidents that happen that are beyond our affected all of us, and suffering emerges. And in those contexts, we have to develop a sense of resiliency, courage, and generosity above and beyond what we normally would have exhibited in times outside of that. And those are moments where, as I articulated earlier, where we are tested. That's what I meant by tests. Well, we have choices that we can make. We can choose to restrict the better parts of, to restrict others and to limit others from the better parts of ourselves, and therefore be complacent with who we are. Or we can choose to transcend ourselves, and we can be audacious about our view of the world, our view of who we could become, and we can push the boundaries of human generosity and human courage and human perception to do something for others. And in that sense, we do something for ourselves. So, you know, we have a parable, you know, in the Islamic tradition that gets passed around that I tend to quote sometimes, where, you know, a grand teacher treats the students to lunch, and there are 3 students, and the teacher says, well, do you want me to, you know, serve you lunch according to, you know, the human justice, the way human beings would dish out and justice, or do you want me to serve you lunch and the way that the way that the divine tends to do things, you know? And the students, the 3 students, of course, you know, deal with us and the way the divine deals with things. And so the teacher takes, you know, some of in the story, it's a rack of lamb, right? So the teacher takes a little bit of the lamb and puts it on one plate, and then takes the rest of the lamb and puts it on the other plate of the child, and leaves the 3rd child with nothing, right? And so the students are like, teacher, this is not balanced. This is not fair. You know, my colleague's got more lamb than me. And the other colleagues say, what are you complaining about? I've got nothing on my plate, right? And the teacher says, well, you asked me to do things the way the divine would do it. So if you see something wrong with the world through no fault of your own, you have the choice to do something about it. Why don't one of you share? Why don't one of you correct the little imbalances that you perceive? So that's what I mean by test. And so instead of critiquing the or looking at other people's suffering and saying, oh my God, that's so horrible, the question then becomes, what can I do, right? What can I do to make that person's life and their lot better, to make my community better in those kinds of contexts? So suffering in the Islamic tradition is a means for people who are in a position to do something, and typically everybody's in a position to do something. There's not an excuse for someone to be silent in the face of suffering. Everybody's got to do their part in some way, form, or fashion. It's an opportunity for folks to alleviate suffering through transcendental charitable behavior and through the lens of justice. So, when we are faced with circumstances where we perceive something's not right, then we also have a perception of what is right, right? And so we need to work to do that, not just have those perceptions, but work towards it. And in that sense, that's the test, right? That's the test. That's what I mean by it being a test. Are we going to just sit idly by, or are we going to make sure that suffering, we don't encounter that suffering, no one else encounters that suffering again?
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Would anybody else like to comment?
Sure, if I may, for just a moment, because one of the concepts that Imam Khalil brought up toward the beginning of this conversation, the concept of suffering that comes from divine love, is a concept that exists in rabbinic tradition as well. Yisurin shel ahava, sufferings that arise out of divine love. And of course it exists there, and I think probably in both of our traditions, because it exists in the Hebrew Psalms that have already been mentioned and elsewhere. There also, though, and maybe this is back to the chutzpah that rabbinic tradition tends to appreciate along with the humility, there also is a place for human beings to say no. No. In the sense of there are deathbed stories of certain rabbis whose disciples, came to them and expected them piously to say, well, these sufferings are good, and said, well, Master, are these sufferings dear to you? To which at least two sages are recorded as having replied, not they and not their reward. In other words, whatever I'm learning this way, I could have learned some other way, and no thank you to that suffering. And that leads me to one other point that I want to be very, very careful about. And I don't think anyone has suggested this, but I think it's another temptation of theology, is to look at suffering in such a way that there has to be a group, call it the poor or the ill, who exist for us to learn lessons by way of them. That's an instrumentalization. In other words, a making of a person into an object rather than a person who could just as well be me. That I want to be very careful about in this time. We are all poor. We are all on the verge of unemployment in this situation, whether we're a hedge fund manager or a custodian in a building in which a hedge fund manager works, right? All of these things are at risk of going out of business, as is so much, if our society really throws the brakes on. So at this time and in general, I want to be very careful about a tendency to embrace attitudes towards suffering that require there to be a suffering class, which very often is someone other than those of us who are privileged to sit around in calls like this talking about them.
No, thank you so much, Rabbi Steinberg, for that. It's unfortunate that it takes a pandemic like this for us to truly realize that, but it's important that we are aware of that moving forward if we weren't before. And I actually, because our time is kind of waning, I wanted to get into another question that relates to this notion that you brought up. It's more so a bioethics rooted question, but as we all know, in this unprecedented situation, which we've really never dealt with before, there's been a huge shortage of ventilators and other life-saving equipment in hospitals for COVID patients. In some places, doctors may need to make agonizing decisions, for example, choosing who will be placed on a ventilator and ultimately be saved. So if you were to advise a healthcare professional who is in the midst of this decision, let's say, for example, they had to choose between a 20-year-old on dialysis or a healthy 60-year-old should be on the ventilator, how would you go about advising them?
You want to answer?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'll go first.
Thanks.
And I'll tie it into suffering, because I would first of all, I don't have the answer, right? I mean, how do I know about a 20-year-old versus a 60-year-old in those situations? But here's what I could say to that healthcare professional. By the fact that you have been placed in position to make this decision, because of your decision to serve others, because of your good fortune to be trained to be able to serve others, and because you're somebody that we're all turning to for hope and help, you're going to suffer tremendously. You're going to suffer tremendously with the guilt and the fear and the sadness that you're going to carry with you for having made that decision on our behalf, on all of our behalf. And it's not fair. It's not fair that you, the person who has trained and worked so hard to help us in this time when we need your help, are going to be the one to carry that burden for the rest of your life. But it's true, you are. And I would say, from my perspective, that the thing that you should know, if I was speaking directly to that person, the thing that you should know from my vantage point is that there is no one right choice that you are supposed to make, that you should feel that you're going to have to live the rest of your life, wondering what would have happened if you'd made it. You were put in an absolutely impossible position. And you will suffer. But what I don't want you to have to feel is the suffering of what if, when you were already placed in an absolutely impossible position. And the other thing that I want to say is, I see the Sophie's Choice comment on there, and there's a reason why that's a classic novel, and I do, it's one of the novels that one might read at this time to get some, for me, I'm not going back to the Psalms at this point, although I can understand why one would, and I have nothing against that, but I'm going back to the secular literature that I consider scripture or liturgy or whatever, and I'm not the only one by any means who has done so. Have great colleagues, Vanessa Zoltan and others, who are known for this, but it's something that all humanists do, actually. Among others, we look at literature as liturgy, and Camus, the Nobel laureate philosopher, existentialist, wrote a novel called The Plague, which is about a viral pandemic, or viral epidemic at least, that comes to represent the suffering of the entire world, where people are trapped in their homes, trapped in a city. They can't get out. They can't get out of the path of this viral disease. And they have to come up with a way to cope with the fact that they're most likely all going to die. Or that they, any of them could die. And it's ultimately actually a very inspiring book, although it doesn't mince words or take it lightly on us as a read, nor does Sophie's Choice. And what I want to say, though, is that we're all poor at this point, and we're all capable of becoming unemployed or becoming a victim of this, and I appreciate that, Jonah. I think you'd agree with me, and I don't think I'm disagreeing with you to say, though, that we're not all poor equally. And we don't all suffer equally. And I happen to believe that suffering as an overall phenomenon is random, completely random. But in the way that it takes shape in our lives and our society and in this pandemic, it is not randomly distributed. It is distributed according to the patterns of our flaws and failings as a society, of our cruelty that we have visited upon one another in the development of the very society that we're lamenting the loss of right now. And so, just as an example, right, we figure out, okay, it seems that blood pressure, high blood pressure, is closely correlated with death or near death from this virus, right? Well, who has high blood pressure disproportionately in this country? Black Americans, African Americans. Why do they have high blood pressure disproportionately? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's because ever since the year 1619, people in this part of the world have been inflicting horrible, despicable, unethical, immoral suffering on Black people in this country. And if you had, and your ancestors and your family and your loved ones all had horrible, unethical, immoral suffering unabatingly inflicted upon you for hundreds of years, your blood pressure would rise. It would. We know that about blood pressure. It's not a mystery. Blood pressure actually, the reason we like to pray or meditate in a lot of our religious or spiritual or ethical traditions is because it physiologically lowers the blood pressure. Read the book, The Relaxation Response by Herbert Benson. Great short book. It physiologically lowers our blood pressure when we breathe in and breathe out the stress and the uncertainty in our lives. But that uncertainty has been visited upon certain people because of the democracy that we're all taking advantage of right now, even in our homes with our Zoom cameras on. And we need, if we want to do the right thing here and we want to have an ethical, moral, spiritual response, we need to spend the time that we have in some way fighting against that inequity, fighting against that unfairness, fighting against it because it could be us. It still could be us, but it's more likely to be the person who's already been victimized. And that's something that we just cannot leave here forgetting. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Chaplain Epstein. That was very powerful. Is there, would anyone else either like to comment or
I can say something. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
So thanks, Greg. That was well said, and I appreciate what you shared with us. I just wanted to add I agree, an impossible question for anyone to answer, and I'm not suggesting that I have an answer to the question, but there were some things that came to mind as I processed this with some other people, and one of them, as a Christian, I do think that we're duty bound to do what love requires in all ethical decision making. And in this particular situation, because there is a limitation on resources, it puts other sort of moral decisions before us that we have to make, and that is that we need to do everything we possibly can to avoid anyone having to make that kind of a decision, right? And I'm admitting that there's no way that we can possibly do the calculus, because we don't know the future of either of these people, of who's going to live longer and if their life is going to add more to the world by letting them live and the other one die. We can't make that decision. What I think we also have an obligation to do then is to do everything we can to be as creative as we possibly can with the agency that God's given us. And I think that's what people are being forced to do, is come up with the most creative solutions they can in every unique situation. It would seem to me that one other sort of important Christian principle that would guide the way, if I were in that, well, actually, let me add this. Another love obligation we have is to do everything we possibly can to support the people who are in these situations now, maybe having to make that decision if in fact they do. I mean, we need to be there supporting them, caring for them, loving them, affirming them. But the other idea is just, and this is sort of a principle of moral decision making that I think comes from the life of Jesus, and that is just the importance of a community, that we shouldn't trust ourselves as having to make these decisions alone. That if I would think it would be wise to pull together the three people in the operating or in the intensive care unit at that moment and say, who, if given this, has the greatest chance of surviving? We've got to make a call, and we can only make it on that alone. And that's, but again, there are people who I trust more than myself to figure out how to train our healthcare professionals to make those kinds of decisions. But that's what I would offer.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much, Chaplain McLeod. I'd actually like to shift now to another core human principle of loss, in particular, intimately tied with suffering. But there's actually an author, Pauline Boss, who in her book, Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief, defines and coins the term ambiguous loss, and she categorizes it into two types. One, which occurs when there is a physical absence with a psychological presence. And a salient example today would be, for example, the social distancing we are experiencing. And then the second type being ambiguous loss, which is where you have psychological absence with physical presence. And we can an example that typifies this kind of ambiguous loss would be, for example, depression or severe anxiety or other chronic mental illness that can affect your psyche. So actually, Chaplain Tammy, I know you have written a lot about this concept, and I was wondering if you could discuss how we can build resilience to this type of loss.
Okay. As I said before, when my son was injured playing high school football and became instantly severely disabled for life, which I started reading grief books, and they didn't help. Just like some things not clicking with me with these books. And it took me 6 years to find Pauline Boss's work. And when I finally found it, it was so exciting that it was someone who understood what I was dealing with. So she's done 3 decades of research on this. I would recommend her books to you. But she says that ambiguous loss is the most stressful kind of loss, and there's no linear process of letting go. Rarely is there acceptance, and there's never closure. And on top of all of those things, she points out that ambiguous loss is rarely validated. So unless someone dies, there's no ceremonies. And so she writes to professionals about 6 areas that she encourages them to work in to help people be resilient in ambiguous loss. And the first one is finding meaning. Pat might want to add something about that later. Second one is adjusting mastery, and we talked about that in this discussion today. We think we can fix everything, we can make everything work, but sometimes we can't. And so we need to adjust our mastery. Third is reconstructing identity. We need to rethink our roles and goals again. And everyone has had to do that since we've all been sitting in our houses. We're connecting now on a screen. That's an example, but I just think of the college students now, they're at home. So they had to shift everything around again, thinking about their roles because they're back with families, many of them now. Who's gonna do what, when, and where? So lots of those conversations have had to take place. Then there's normalizing ambivalence. And that, she points out that just means if you are enjoying some things about the situation you're in right now and you also hate it, that's a normal thing. So we can love and hate things at the same time. So she talks a lot about ambivalence and normalizing it. The 5th one is revising your attachment to people. So in ambiguous loss, you don't lose the bond of love you had with people, like your friends from college. but you have to revise the way you relate to them. So again, now we're playing games online, we're talking online, we're working online, we're worshiping online. And then the last one is to discover hope. And she talks about maintaining realistic hopes. If you hold on to unrealistic hopes too long, you won't be able to focus on what needs to get done right now in front of you and in other relationships. So she talks about finding something new and positive to look forward to, some other human connection or cause beyond ourselves. And I wanted to just give one idea of how I do that. I think it's really important to look for in-breaking hope. Henry Nouwen is an author I love that talks about this. And this is a spiritual practice that I do every day to help me find in-breaking hope. It's called examine. So at the end of the day, I just pray back through the day, looking for what was life-giving or life-thwarting. And by looking at those life-giving things, I can see where hope was breaking into the day.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's all things that we can put into practice, hopefully, as we are all universally affected by this in some way or another. So I think now we are going to switch to questions that have been asked by some of the participants in this group. The first question is, it was asked earlier in the chat by Priya Kukreja, and she asked, how exactly, we had briefly touched upon this, but I think it would be good to ask the question. She asks, how do we reconcile this opportunity to better ourselves, to find courage, to come together and fight fear with the tragic reality of the people whose lives are being taken and perhaps in a sense sacrificed to test us? I think that is, I think this may be pointed more towards the faith or the faith leaders, and I guess the faith leaders, or really anyone. It's open to all, actually. So whoever would like to chime in and hopefully take or respond to her question.
I'd be glad to respond.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very grateful for Tammy's answer, and I just wanted to follow up on that and say, I don't think we've even begun to think about the loss really that people are experiencing in terms of the shifting. We had to do it fast. Those of you who are students had to do it really fast. And I think the question of how we ritualize that and how we open space for people to come together to talk through it, to mourn it, to grieve. I don't think, as in religious communities, I think we haven't even gotten there yet. Time just feels so compressed and everything has happened so fast. I think there are some religious holidays coming up, Passover, Holy Week, Easter, that have these questions about suffering at the center of them. And there are, ways to move through these times in community that can be very healing. But I think both the ability to ritualize the ambiguous loss we're experiencing, and also what happens when we start to come back into life. How are we going to do that? How are we going to cross that boundary back into physical relationship with each other? I don't think it will happen overnight in one big ta-da, but little by little, our communities will have to resurrect as well as ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's something I think we can all be thinking about together. As chaplains, we should be thinking about together. The question that you just raised, Sana, about how we embrace the possibilities that this time brings, the possibilities for spiritual practice and for deepening of our understanding of our humanity, etc. And how do you hold that in relation to the actual suffering that's going on? I mean, that's a deeply human question for every day of our lives, made more vivid right now. Mm-hmm. And I think it shows the way we're having to hold these things in tension. If we're not sick, and if our loved ones aren't sick, we're kind of watching this from a distance in a way. We're watching the news and seeing healthcare workers, having to make difficult decisions, just doing heroic, amazing work. But it can feel kind of, there's a distance, just like there's a distance between us. And I think something about, there's this time, one of the opportunities of this time, I think, is thinking about how we cross those distances and what we fill those distances with. How do we fill these distances with love and with compassion and with attention to the suffering of others? I don't think I have an actual answer to that question that has been posed, except to say that it's really important to ask it, and to think about how we're going to attend to each other's suffering in this time.
Mm-hmm. No, okay. Thank you so much, Professor Paulsell. Would anybody else like to add on to that? Or yes, Rabbi Steinberg.
The question you're now asking is so related to the question of suffering and the question of grieving, and again to what Greg said. And absolutely, those of us who are on this call are so inordinately privileged in this moment to get to take some time to do meaning making together amid this catastrophe. I just want us to take stock for a moment, and here I'm right with Greg, and when I said all poor, I mean all human, all susceptible to illness, all susceptible to poverty. But those of us who are able to be on this call in this moment are so also we are the ones who are on a vanguard perhaps of thinking about this, and we have to have some humility about that because we don't yet know even what we're talking about. I come from a community, and many of us on this call come from other communities that collectively have suffered terrible, terrible trauma. So if I say we're doing meaning making while we're still in the midst of this, who would presume to do meaning making about the Holocaust in the face of people who suffered it, or ever, and to remember that. So the note of God, it's not that we shouldn't seek meaning, it's that we should seek meaning with tremendous humility, and tremendous acknowledgement of what a blessed and here I go to Greg's randomness. None of us should think we get to be on this call as opposed to on a ventilator because we deserve to be here, rather than others who have wound up on ventilators. So for all that, right? Abominable, blasphemous as it can be to try to make sense of catastrophe, and we should remember that. We also are creatures of storytelling. That's our occupation as a species. We are meaning makers, and we tell story, and we sing song, and this is our, it's kind of the bird song of our species to do so. And so here, to bring it to your question about suffering, how do we deal with that trauma? The best we can do is to try to deal with it as the most full human beings we possibly can be, and to try to make it possible for as many other human beings to be as fully human being as they can be, and join with us in that project of seeking, of searching, of trying, of wondering what's the world we want, and how can we how can we make it.
No, that's a very fair point, and I think it's important, to keep that in mind. I want to go back to this point that Greg was discussing about suffering and just the nature of suffering. there was a question posed which asks, though we are universally affected in this, why are some affected more than others? For example, the severity of your suffering can vary from person to person. And I guess just discussing the underpinnings behind it or the rationalizations behind it would be very helpful. I know, Greg, you had briefly mentioned how suffering is random. It is this randomization which leads us to come to this. If there are other explanations that maybe can help us in our minds rationalize this, that would be amazing. Oh, Imam Khalil, yes.
Yeah, I think, I think it's important to keep in mind that, when you think of, there's no rationalization of suffering. There's no way to rationalize that. But what you do have to do is I think, when we think about suffering, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is to also think about healing. Healing is really, really integral and very, very important to keep in mind, that nobody, to try to rationalize who's suffering more or less. There is a reality to that, yes, but there's also reality to the importance of healing. And there's a great emphasis put on in the Islamic tradition and the importance of healing whenever suffering is encountered. We're going to encounter, we are headed for tremendous days and weeks ahead. And one of the things that our country and our communities are going to I think, pivot toward is collective healing efforts. And what healing means in different, because, one of the aspects about this situation, of one of the unique circumstances of the Civil War in this country was the reality, the unfortunate reality of encountering suffering, or let's call it death, alone, in isolation. And the fact that people, our country in the Civil War had never experienced that, the idea of dying alone. And our country is now revisiting that. And it's extremely, to have a loved one, or even just to know somebody with a relative in the hospital, that alone is traumatic. To have a loved one in the hospital that's isolated is traumatic. And so, we are going to, as a country, have to deal with different suffering. But I think what allows everyone to equally participate in enduring and helping to share strength and to share positive, in the words of Rabbi Jonah, who so eloquently spoke about the importance of narratives, right? It's the healing that has to be done, which does not eliminate suffering, but nor does it try to impose meaning on suffering. But healing, I think, is therapeutic and helpful, beneficial in humanizing us in various ways, where suffering tends to dehumanize us in many different ways. And so what I think is, when we talk about suffering, I think we have to also talk about healing as well. And I just wanted to mention that as well. And I think if we talk about the need for, with the presence of suffering, you also have the presence of the need for healing as well.
No, thank you so much, Imam Khalil. It's very important to keep that in mind. I think I'd also like to very briefly go to another question that was raised. This is mainly for the faith leaders. So what would you say to the skeptics? What would you say to those who are, and also of course, Greg, I hope you will chime in as well, but how do we what do we say to them in light of this pandemic? Would anyone like to start with this? Yes, Chaplain McLeod.
Faith. It's for people of faith and not faith. So I just think straight across everything about ambiguous loss is something that people who don't have a faith tradition can really use in their lives, just to realize this is the most stressful kind of loss and there's no closure right now. And so there are these 6 things that I can really think about and talk with my friends about to work through the ambiguous loss that I'm experiencing. So I think her work, which is research-based and vast, would be really helpful.
Fantastic. I think it's great to have concrete resources to draw our attention to at this time. So that's a great reference. And I hope more people, this was the first time you had actually introduced me to her work, and now I'm kind of getting more into it. So thank you so much for introducing me to that work. I would also like to kind of move to another question that was mentioned for the families out there who have little children who are experiencing all of this craziness. What would you, or how can this pandemic be explained to children without inciting fear or just scaring the living daylights out of them?
I recommend an article that I can put in the chat after this that came out of the recent Veritas Forum. What was her name? It was an excellent forum, maybe the best Veritas Forum that I've ever seen, and it was done online. Her name's Lydia Dugdale. If I don't get this in the chat before the end, I'll just give you the name. And so she's a professor, I think, at Columbia School of Medicine, and she's written articles on the art of dying. And she thinks it's a mistake in our culture right now that we've lost this tradition that was actually, it was kind of birthed out of the 13th century, one of the plagues that just wiped out, like they say, as much as 2/3 of the population of Europe. What was that? Does anyone remember? It doesn't matter. Okay, so I'll get to the point. She basically thinks that we need to not insulate people in general, and even our children, from the reality of their mortality, and that we need to allow them to understand that, part of what we're going to do in life is we do need to prepare for the fact that we'll one day die. And so maybe, I don't know, that I would just recommend the article. It is one of those other things that I meant to mention when I was talking about that hypothetical of having to make that ethical decision. I think we are duty bound as Christians who are driven by an ethic of love to be able to be training people in how to die well, and how to face up to the fact that, we're going to die one day. And how do we prepare for that?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much. And hopefully I can get that article to those who are participating as well.
Okay.
I just really quickly, before this ends, like to go back to Greg. If he very quickly can just embellish on his comment in the chat, that would be awesome. I think his perspective is very valued at this time. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, you're still muted.
Okay, you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, you mean the comment where I said you guys can all do what the skeptics, yes, what to say to the skeptics, and then I'll do what the skeptics say to you. Well, first of all, I mean, as you can see, I don't know, if it comes across as purposeful or what, but I've really tried to determined to maintain some sense of humor in all of this.
Mhm.
And I'd like to think, and I don't know, none of us knows what we would do if the suffering really came to our door. But I would like to think that that is a permanent decision, that I would find some way to hold on to, even if things get worse for me personally or my family. But again, who knows?
Mhm.
And I guess I'll tie it to the child thing, because I have a 3.5-year-old son. He's my best bud. He's my friend. And I'm suddenly spending, I basically do about 8 hours of one-on-one childcare these days a day. Literally 8 hours. I mean, maybe some days 7 if my wife's, feeling, extra peppy that day. You can, I just posted something on Twitter where I bought a helium tank before things got really bad, because I was like, well, we'll blow up helium balloons if we're really stuck inside. And so that, you can see the dumb results of that on Twitter if you want. It's something that's really been important to me about how to communicate with him about this, which is that from the beginning, I've tried to take the approach that there is absolutely nothing that I wouldn't talk to him about this. There's absolutely nothing that I would keep from him or try to sugarcoat for him. But I also try to be really sensitive to what he wants to know and what his concerns are. So, the thing that takes the hardest work on my part is really watching and listening to him for what it is that he's noticing or is concerned about. And if he asks a question, to try to answer it to the best of my ability in the language that would make sense to him, and then shut up, which is always the biggest struggle for me. Oh man, shutting up is my kryptonite. But to shut up and let him decide whether he wants to know more about that, or whether he wants to move on to the next, stupid balloon game that we're going to play. And honestly, I mean, I think that's working. I mean, I don't want to place too much faith in it, but I would say that if you're looking for an approach to take with yourself or with your own family, or if you ever find yourself in this position with a young one, I think that's a worthwhile approach to take. What the skeptics would then therefore say back to you is I love you, we love you. We might disagree on this stuff. There might be certain aspects of it where we really disagree, but boy, we love you and we need you. And I hope you'll feel the same way about us, that we really are all in this together. And it's going to take all of the resources and all of the ideas and all of the inner strength that every single one of us bring to this call, to get us out of this situation with some decency and some humanity left intact. And I can learn so much from each and every one of you. And then we can maybe thumb wrestle about our theological debates. I love you.
No, we all, I hold so much love for you all, and thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg, for that. And honestly, a little laughter is never hurt anyone, so it might help in these dire times. And I just wanted to thank. It seems like we've reached or kind of gone over our time limit, but I really would like to thank all of you for coming and for speaking and for imparting your wisdom to us all. And I have so much love for you all, and it's really been a pleasure. And unfortunately, we will have to end it now, but thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And thank you to all of the participants who came as well and who were able to listen in. So